This is the Lean Construction Blogs Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories, case studies, and lessons learned of applying lean construction from around the world. Join Dick Beyer as he interviews industry leaders, lean construction practitioners, and subject matter experts to help you improve the build environment in general and your design and construction projects in particular. Advance your lean journey and bring your continuous improvement efforts to the next level. Let's get started.
Okay, let's get started. Well, good day, everybody. Welcome to the Lean Construction Blog Podcast with Dick Beyer. Today, I have the great honor of having a good friend of mine who started off as my lawyer and is responsible, or minions of his firm are responsible for me being in Canada and staying here. And I could kind of go through the entire process I had of trying to get back from England a few weeks ago, but we're going to save that story for another day. And today we're going to concentrate on how integrated project delivery and lean construction and design have migrated across the border, and how important it was to set up a contractual vehicle that Canadians would be familiar with. And it turns out that Canada's best construction lawyer, recognized as such in some past year, a dean of the College of Canadian Lawyers, the head of the drafting committee for the Candian Construction Documents Council. He's got more kudos than you can fit into a kudo car. Let me welcome to today's podcast, my good friend, Geza Banfai. Geza.
Hello, Dick, and thank you for that truly overly generous introduction. I'm not the dean of the Canadian College of Construction Lawyers. I'm just a member. It's
collegial in the greatest sense of the word, I guess, eh?
Yes, it is.
So let's introduce you to our North American viewers, and this podcast has been heard and viewed in 37 different countries. So it's truly ecumenical, international, whatever. So tell us a little bit about yourself that is different than what I told everybody about you.
Well, I'll tell them the truth.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Which is quite a concept for a lawyer. I mean,
well, it is. But no, I practice construction law. I've been doing it since 1978, which brings me coming up to 42 years now. I didn't start out this way. I mean, I went to university at age 17 because I skipped a grade and didn't know what I wanted to do. So I thought engineering sounded interesting. So I enrolled at the University of Toronto, but I didn't know what kind of engineering. They had a program there called engineering science, which is a general sort of program. Finished the year and then changed track and ended up in law school. Worked in a small firm for a year and a half. Saw an ad in the local paper for a job at in another firm, then called Blaney, Pasternak, Smela, and Watson. They were looking for a junior construction lawyer. Sounded interesting, and the rest is history.
Wow.
So here I am dealing with engineering principles all over again.
You know, I've known for a long time that we are brothers from different mothers because my grandfathers, on the one hand, my grandfather Stuart was a Stanford educated engineer who was in charge of the big gears that control the water that flows through dams for the Bureau of Reclamation. And my other grandfather was a international lawyer and law professor. So I was torn between all of those things. And I was pretty much committed to having a radio career.
Here you are.
Yeah. So, there are some differences, but there are some significant differences, I think, between how law is practiced in Canada and how it is in the States.
We'd like to think that here in Canada, we're nicer than you guys. Although I'm told by my American friends that they're constantly surprised by how much we litigate up here, whereas how much they settle down there. So there are some differences. I mean, it's a relatively speaking much smaller bar up here. It's a much smaller industry. I mean, up here everybody knows everybody. I'm not sure the same could be said down in the States, where you have such a huge population of contractors and lawyers and so on.
Yeah, there's 360 million people, and about 280 million of them at least think that they're lawyers. One of the things I've noticed is that, and we've discussed this, Canadians take contracts pretty seriously. In the States, you sign a contract and it's often just the beginning of the negotiations. for the amendment to the contract or the change order or whatever you want to call it. But here, people seem to take them seriously, like judges routinely award liquidated damages if that's called for, because liquidated damages is a penalty. And the courts abhor imposing penalties if, in fact, you could figure damages out. There's very few cases that are easier to figure damages out than in construction.
The basic idea, as you know, about liquidated damages is that it's intended as a genuine pre-estimate of loss in circumstances in which calculating the loss is difficult or impossible. So you agree in advance, having directed your mind to some approximation, some calculation, so as to avoid the controversy later on in the event that the damages are assessable. They seem to have taken on a life of their own in some cases, and now you have LDs being prescribed for all kinds of crazy things. The loss of a key personnel. I think a lot of people have a misconception about them. They view them as you've described them, as a penalty, as a sum in terrorem to force compliance, and that's not quite what the law specifies. And so you have these problems up here. And I used to think that contractors were generally opposed to them. Not quite. I've been told by more than one contractor that actually they like them because it allows them to assess their risk and quantify it at the bidding stage.
Right.
And this segues us, of course, into risk and buying and selling risk and the themes of IPD.
But it's also like one of those kind of crazy, what I tend to refer to as reverse incentives, because if you can, one of the hallmarks of contract law for 500 years has been you have the right to violate a contract with impunity as long as you're willing to pay damages for it, which is why punitive damages and those things have hardly been awarded in contracts. But the bar in the States is not routinely sophisticated enough to understand that. So people are constantly, making claims for punitive damages in contracts. But the ability to just buy your way out of a contract by paying liquidated damages seems to me as a kind of perverse reverse incentive. Because it would encourage you to just violate the contract and say, well, it's cheaper for me. And I love to talk about the law because I love the law. What's great about contracts in the common law tradition is that it is a completely developed system. Yep. It's a system that has everything in it. And when we think about systems, which we try to think about in IPD and we try to think about in any kind of process, it is a system that developed from the experience of the people and not necessarily the judgment of the king, which I always thought was really interesting and cool about it.
This business about contracts, Dick, I've thought for a long time, and this sort of ties into something that you said earlier about Canada versus the US. I've always had the sense that we in Canada take our contracts a little too serious, in the sense that you've got a contract, there's been a problem. So the next contract, well, we're gonna put in a clause that solves that last problem,
right? And
so on and so on and so on. At the end of the day, what are you striving for? The perfect contract, which of course is an impossibility. There's this sense, the mistaken sense, in my view, that if we could just get to as close to a perfect contract as we could, all our problems would be solved. That is such a fallacy. I have this saying. As I age, I have sayings, Dick, and I have to really cut this out. But
as you age, they become aphorisms.
I guess they do. But it's this: good people will usually make a bad contract work, whereas bad people will invariably make a good contract fail. There are limits to contract. As we all,
I think that's the genesis of a more relational contract, right? Because contracts fail the same way that estimation fails, the same way that schedules fail, the same way that weather predictions fail. Yes. We try to predict the future, and we try to, especially in contracts, try to solve the future by creating incentives one way or the other, usually financial, sometimes bullying incentives,
yes,
but usually financial, to try to get people to do the right thing. And yet 3 years down the road, what looked like the right thing 3 years ago is perhaps not the right thing now. And so some people are taking advantage of their superior bargaining power back in the day, and now they're using the contract to drive a wedge. So rather than those very predictive contracts, and I have worked, as you know, on the supplementary conditions for CCDC 30 on 4 different projects with 6 different law firms. And the lawyers are always trying to get these anti-IPD, but client protective measures in there because they think their job is to protect their client, right, and not to create an atmosphere for success of the project.
Right.
And I think that's one of the difficulties. That's why, you and I need to get out there and evangelize with the lawyers as much as we need to with the owners.
Well, this is an excellent point, Dick. I mean, I see this with my professional colleagues up here, and most lawyers, I think, and they come by this quite honestly, that their job is to protect their client. And what you're experiencing, this doesn't surprise me at all, is what is a holdover actually of a mode of being in this new paradigm of IPD, where it's completely inappropriate. I think the job of a lawyer in an IPD contract, frankly, is to focus. Well, first of all, is to understand that there are limits to that contract. The contract, and you've got a great metaphor for this. I don't know if it's yours or somebody else's, but the contract is like the hardware, and the real operating system is lean. So what does the contract do? Well, it sets the ground rules of engagement, the hardware for the relationship. And so the real job of the lawyer in an IPD contract, in my view, is to make sure that hardware recognizes the relational characteristics of the relationship and addresses itself to, among other things, governance. The governance of the relationship is tremendously important, as you know, right, in IPD. But if you want to go further and put in stuff that protects your client at the expense of the other, you're defeating the purpose of the thing.
Ian McNeil came up with the idea of a relational contract. He dispensed with offer and acceptance and consideration and legality and capacity as the 5 hereditaments of everything we were taught about contracts in law school. And he focused on the exchange and the reciprocity. And yet we are now 50, 60 years on from McNeil and his thinking back in the 70s. I mean, when you and I started practicing, and still we're still at offer, acceptance, buy, sell, risk shifting provisions, all of these kinds of crazy things, just like we're still at critical path, which doesn't make sense to anybody if you can spend 5 minutes with them and they go, well, you're just a lawyer, you're confusing me. This is what my mother used to tell me. I never had an argument with her and I was taking her down. Oh, well, it just doesn't sound right to me. You must just be a lawyer. You've got magic words. You're trying to convince me that this is what we're going to do.
Well, there's great truth in what she said, isn't there?
So I moved on from being just a lawyer. So that's why I got here, I think.
To being right.
Well, I think that's what motivated me not to be an engineer, because, in engineering, it's very important that you be right. I mean, that, you get it right, or buildings collapse and bridges fall down and bad things happen. So you have to get it right. And in the law, this will sound crazy, but I think it's better that you're poetic and artistic and you have a big picture of how the world actually works, so that you can tell stories to people in a way that those stories have meaning. You've had a career as a construction lawyer. You've been both in the English tradition, a solicitor and a barrister.
We are more civilized, Dick.
There is a certain civility that happens up here. So what led you to get involved in IPD? Were there cases that you had where you thought, wow, the system's really not working very well? Or
no, I was I think it was 2008. I was asked to join the Candian Construction Documents Committee, CCDC. And they had a spot there for me, what they call their ex officio legal representative. So I was the lawyer around this table. It's a committee of maybe.
And you were the only lawyer, right?
At that point, yes. Yeah. And so they thought they could use a lawyer. So they could actually, if to mediate among them, if for no other reason. But it's a small group of about 15 or 16 people, consisting of representatives of owners, generals, trades, architects, engineers, and spec writers. And the mandate of CCDC, as is the case in a number of American organizations, is to create standard forms that the industry will hopefully adopt and use. And about I've lost track of the years, 5 or 6 years ago, I think, the then chair of CCDC, Walter Strachan, decided that we ought to prepare a standard form of agreement in IPD, and he prevailed upon the powers that be to approve this and fund it. And we established a subcommittee of about 11 or 12 people, and we, over the course of about a year and a half or so, we met and moved from ground zero to CCDC 30, which is the first version of the IPD contract with which we are now working. By the way, we're beginning to think about the revisions to CCDC 30 in light of experience over those years, to tweak it and make it better.
I hope to be part of those conversations.
You're more than welcome, Dick. Seriously. But no, that's how we did it. We started from ground zero. So the first several meetings were interesting because we brought in people who were familiar with IPD, and they began educating us. In those first several meetings, all of us, picture the scene. You've got 11 or 12 people, all from CCDC, all of whom are of a certain age. The accumulated experience around that table is measured in hundreds of years, and we've all grown up steeped in the traditional way of doing things: design, bid, build, CM, design, build. And here we are listening to people talking about a whole new world. And there was a bit of a deer in the headlights quality to the thing at the outset. It took quite a while, actually, to reorient our worldview away from all of that into the new paradigm that IPD requires. And just while I'm talking about this, there's an interesting phenomenon emerged from all of this, and that is that the people on that committee we're all members of the CCDC itself. So we're having these meetings dealing with IPD, and then we're also having the regular CCDC meetings that we also go to deal with updates to the design, bid, build agreement, or CM or something. And for most of us, it became a little disconcerting going back to the normal CCDC meetings. There's a schizophrenic quality to the whole damn thing.
Right.
And so many of us are still in that schizophrenic mode. But,
yeah, I can certainly empathize with that because, in Canada, the Canadian Construction Association has a separate committee that they call the Lean Construction Institute of Canada.
Yeah.
But it's really just a committee. It's not really an institute. And so we had discussions about trying to bring that out of CCA and make that a standalone organization in which they would participate fully with designers and everybody else. Because I saw one of their meeting brochures one time, and their annual meeting had in the Ambassador Salon #1, Lean Construction, Ambassador Salon #2, how to make a claim for delay damages in your contract.
Right.
Ambassador Room #3, how to use CCDC 2 to drive a wedge between your contractor and trades. Right. I mean, it was just like, how can these things exist in the same building, much less the same kind of world? Right.
Yeah. It's a problem. And I felt for a long time, and still do, that among the impediments to a more fulsome adoption of IPD within Canada is simply the fact that we're not talking amongst ourselves, not nearly as much as we should, not coordinating efforts, not nearly as much as we should. You've got the COPs in the lean world who are out there having their meetings. You've got the LCI who's doing its thing. There's you and your team who's doing its thing. There are the people out west, IPDA, who are doing their thing. And there is now, as you know better than I, Dick, there is now quite a group of people within this country who actually have some pretty good experience in IPD and lien. And I think we need to get people talking to each other in some sort of coordinated fashion.
For sure. I mean, I have seen the disparate applications of it, and some people think that IPD is an actual thing, right? It's a philosophy and a self-effectuating system, and it creates all of this stuff. And as I've said, my metaphor for IPD is it's the bomb squad. It comes in, it gets rid of all the impediments to doing a lean operating system, because you can't really do a lean operating system in the current system. It's very difficult to do, both the collaborative piece of it and all of the lean design and construction tools that we have.
Yeah, because we've structured our contracts to get in the way of all of that.
Right. Well, there have been very clear divisions, and it really, this is a North American, this is a Anglo Canadian American Commonwealthian, anywhere that the common law has sprouted up, the same ideas about incentives, whether they, come from Adam Smith, who actually, before he wrote Wealth of Nations, he wrote a great book on morality and how you need to have empathy for your neighbor and all kinds of things. And people forget that he was a moralist before he was an economist.
That's right.
The idea that these incentives drive people to behave is exposed immediately when you say, well, okay, so you have liquidated damages. How is Bob going to act differently because he faces liquidated damages? And we see that, when there are these significant penalties like the O train in Ottawa, once those penalties started making raising their hoary little head, all of a sudden there was acceleration on the line that led to all kinds of safety problems and all kinds of mechanical problems and everything else. So we incentivize ourselves into bad behavior sometimes with these contracts.
Well, it gets worse than that, as you know. I mean, when you see the LDs looming on the horizon, in addition to everything you've just described, what else do they do? Well, they go to their lawyers.
Right.
And, the notices start to fly. Nothing good ever comes of this.
Well, the real enemy of the people there is res judicata, I've always decided, because, at least as it's practiced in the States, everything has to be resolved in one piece of litigation. So it leads construction cases to be not between this person and that person. It involves everybody, because you have a claim against me while I'm trying to kick that claim down to Bob, and Bob's trying to kick it over to Jeannie, and Jeannie has a claim back against you. And all of a sudden, it's always a nuclear conflagration. Yeah. It's never some small little targeted action for a $1,500 change order.
And that's partly because, of course, the construction process is never between any two people. It's a tightly coupled, interwoven web, and poke it in one corner, and you're going to get reverberations all over the place. And here you go.
Yeah, and I think that's fundamentally what's wrong with the lump sum and design bid build industry, is that it doesn't recognize that this is a network of commitments, that this is a team that has to come together in some fashion and deliver it. It believes that each of these little parts can be delivered on their own, and then that's going to give you something. And it does give you things like lawsuits and delays and overruns, terrible things.
Yeah. And the theory, of course, the theory is that, if everybody in this tightly interwoven network of contracts does what they're supposed to do, it's all supposed to work every time flawlessly. And the reality, of course, is that most of the time, that may be true if one could predict in advance all of the contingencies that could happen in the process, but one cannot. Most of the time, something happens. Stuff happens.
Regardless of contract model.
Regardless of the model, regardless of the best intentions, regardless of anything. So now you've poked one piece of that tightly coupled network, and the way that the contractual arrangements are set up, where they're bilateral and everybody's trying to maximize their value within that bilateral relationship, it ends up in disaster. So,
it's almost as if you had a city like London that had no main roads, that everything was a bilateral connection, right? For me to get to you, I had to go to Bob, I had to go to Jeannie, I had to go to Joe, I had to go to Fred, and then I can get to you. And then for you to get to me, you have to come back that way too. So there's no way that I can just call you up and say, hey, Geza, what about this $1,700 escalation of copper? I mean, this is why I think IPD was designed. I mean, what you're talking about is all those unknowns are risk, right? And risk is just what we don't know. I mean, I've got maybe 12 books on my shelf, 12 books back here in this extensive library of mine that try to talk about risk as something different than just what we don't know, right? It becomes the outcome of probability rather than just what we don't know. And IPD was designed to get as many people on board as early as possible so that you could know more than you can know in these opaque bilateral contracts.
That's right. Or part of the challenge of the cultural change that's required in order to get greater IPD use within the country is getting over the habit of profiting on that opacity.
Right.
I mean, the contracting community, for whom I have tremendous respect and admiration, they profit on opacity. There's money to be made because of the mental model that people use.
Right.
If everything is a negotiation, well, I'm not going to lay all my cards on the table in a negotiation. I'm going to hold back, and those who negotiate best make the most.
The struggle that we have, I think, in Canada, more so than the States, but in the States as well, is that in order for there to be a paradigm shift, there's the Kuhn corollary or the Kuhn whatever, which says that the system is going along and then all of a sudden the system gets out of balance.
Yes.
And the pressure on the system to change has to be much greater than the cost of changing.
Yes.
So as long as you're tooting along and the cost to the participants isn't that great, pressure on one side, the owner who's getting less value than they should, is getting projects later than they should, getting projects that aren't, that don't reach the value proposition that they had hoped for or that they had aspired to. That pressure is just not felt by the contracting community. I mean, when I work with big teams, especially on these bigger projects, these $500 million projects, these $200 and $300 million projects, and on a multi-billion-dollar project like the center block, there's no pressure on the contractors to think that anything's really wrong. The design firms really don't know their own business well enough to understand that there are some things that are really kind of wrong about that model, because they're designers, they're not contractors, and they don't really think of their business as opaque, but their business is opaque to them as well, because they don't really track where they make their money, because money's not a thing that if you're a designer you talk about, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And to some extent, the trades have the most fully developed understanding of what it takes for them to deliver their jobs and still be profitable. But that requires opacity, and it requires territory, and it requires superiority on the job, and not necessarily teamwork. So,
well, and I don't blame any of those groups because there's precious little incentive. Things are okay. We're
doing fine.
We're doing fine. Our profits are, we're maintaining our profits. And yeah, I'm a big company, and every year I got to budget $5 million for legal, but that's just a cost of doing business. And the source of change, and in terms of, I think we're building up this pressure that you're talking about in the Kuhnian sense. The source of change is going to be the owner community.
Right.
And you're seeing it. We're seeing it.
Yes, absolutely.
Owners and they're becoming more and more enlightened.
Right.
And annoyed about the fact that they're just not getting the value that they should be getting. They're tired of the constant fighting, and all of the negative stuff that's inherent in the traditional way of doing things. And they've heard about this, and they want to explore this. And so it's refreshing to me, I'm sure to you too, to encounter some owners who are amazingly enlightened. I was not participating, but I was enrolled in a talk recently involving collaborative contracting models, and they had a representative from the city of Kelowna in British Columbia who was talking about how they do things in a collaborative way down there, and they have been for quite a while. It was amazing listening to this guy for me, because he was in some sense living in a completely different world than the world of the municipalities with which I'm most familiar. He was so far, I'm not sure he was aware of it. He was so far ahead of the curve that it was breathtaking. They're now at the point where the collaborative model is the way they do things, and it's working like a charm for them.
It's interesting because my friend Carla Sipliski from out in Calgary, who knows a thing or two about all this stuff, said that there is a movement especially in British Columbia, to recreate project management, as it were. So to move away from the PMBOK, the Project Management Institute Book of Knowledge, right, way of doing things as oversight, and begin at the very beginning to assess what are our needs and how do we best meet our needs, which is really what is at the very heart of big room management and values development and big ideas, is to assess, what's the value proposition? What are we trying to do here for owners? And I think it has, according to Carlos, that has taken off like wildfire. So they're used to that. They're not used to this templated, here's our P6 schedule, and this is what it tells us that we have to do. One of the senior members of an international cost consulting firm said in a meeting the other day, there's time, cost, and quality, and you can really only have two of those.
Yeah, sure.
I'm going, no, you can actually have all three. And I think that's what owners are saying is, I want all three. And the owners representatives that we work with, the people that run the project from the owner's side, they have bosses as well. And their bosses are going, well, why are these things consistently over budget? Or how do we know that budget was right? I mean, there's some projects that have been delivered, some IPD projects that have been delivered, substantially under budget. And I begin to wonder with those as to whether, was the budget the right budget? Because there is a right amount of time and a right amount of money that it takes to build something of the right quality, right? We just haven't gotten to that spot because of the kind of the price cost differential, right? The cost of doing something is hardly ever reflected in the price. I mean, it's all in there, but the price represents the number of touches between people along the line who want a piece of that.
Right.
And that's the opacity. That's one of the opaque curtains that we want to open up, right, in the IPD world, is that why aren't we paying for just the cost of the stuff that we're asking for? So with those challenges, what do you tell owners? What is what's the key, do you think, to their pushing the right buttons so that they have the courage actually to engage in a system that is not what their procurement system is set up to deal with at all?
The first thing I tell them is thanks for calling.
It's a good start.
It's a very good start, because it means you've already made an important decision, which many owners have not. So thanks for calling. I then typically, I engage with them in a chat about what they're looking for in this particular project they're thinking about, but also their experience, their capabilities in-house. Usually, I find myself saying, at some point in the conversation, okay, here's a suggestion. You should give this guy buyer a call.
Better call Saul.
Better call Saul, and carry this forward. Because I say to them, look, and perhaps I'm a little too blunt sometimes, but I say to them, look, IPD is not a silver bullet. If you are going into this simply because you've read an article or somebody's mentioned it at a party, or sounds like a good idea, it's a good start, but there's a there's a process of learning and growth that has to happen with an owner in terms of allowing IPD to be successful. So if you, owner, are telling me that you get that and you're prepared to make the investment of time and resources necessary to enhance that process of learning and growth, then great. But if you're looking at this thing as just a design, bid, build by other means, you're bound for failure. Better do design, bid, build. At least you know it, and your expectations are what they are. So I hope I don't talk too many of them out of it. But I think as we know, Dick, I mean, you got to be realistic about this stuff,
right?
And fortunately, my experience, at least yours too, I'm sure, there are lots, an increasing number of owners who understand that, okay, we're not, we've been operating under the old paradigm. It hasn't been working. We are sufficiently dissatisfied now,
right,
to do the necessary to move from there to here, and we're sufficiently dissatisfied to consider the investments necessary to for that learning to be made. And that's wonderful. And then I refer them to other owners who've already done this, and they can compare notes.
Well, I think one of the important things is that it takes a substantial amount of courage to do this. So I think that's one of the things you have to tell an owner, because if you're going to get the value from an IPD contract, it means that you are controlling where the money is spent, and you're trying to focus spending the money on things that are valuable to the ultimate project. What's valuable to the owner's value proposition, right? What solves that value proposition? And you have to be able to tell a design firm, we're not paying for a spec writer, because we're developing those things. We're developing the equivalent of specs in the validation process.
Yes.
And it's not valuable to us to have somebody take those specs and write them down in a big spec book when everybody sat at the table and developed them, and they know exactly what it is that's required. We don't need your submittal person, because we're not having submittals. We're deciding in design what's the air handler that we're buying, and we're deciding the process for buying that. And we don't need your additional superintendents who are there to catalog claims and to try to manage scope, because when we hire the drywaller does the drywall scope, whatever that happens to be, and they're paid time and materials for it. So maximizing that ability to input the value proposition into the day-to-day management of the job, and to lose people on the job. I mean, you have to send people away so that you can maximize the savings in labor, which is really the key to the lean operating system, is to not do all of those processes that cost us money, like RFIs that cost us $1,000 because there's 19 touches and we have waived liability amongst each other. So we don't care if we go back and say that, well, that was approved or authorized, because our contract doesn't provide for that.
Yeah. You've described this as an act of courage. Well, I suppose it is, but I'm listening to you, and I agree with you, and I think of it as an act of giving permission to an owner to do things, ask questions, make inquiries that he's always wanted to do.
Right. Open the present before Christmas. Make sure it's not a lump of coal, right?
Exactly. And this, I guess, again, ties into the opacity point and that old model. Well, I went to tender and here are my prices, and I can't negotiate. I can't ask questions, but that get behind the prices, and so on and so on and so on. Actually, you can. You have permission in this model, and
we're still using the same old procurement system to gather people in this model. So you and I had a recent conversation about the procurement of a team where we were unable to go outside of the response in the RFI and say, Well, these people have had lawsuits. These people have made claims, and these people have challenges, and we can't out them because the procurement process in the broader public sector requires a very narrow blinders on focus around, the RFI and those kinds of things. So how do we?
Well, there's room there, but there's room there. You can set the rules of procurement to give you those privileges. And I think, as we do more and more of these, we'll probably find that the rules of the procurement sitting in the tender documents are going to be modified to allow precisely what you've just said, to make background checks. I mean, it's there in many procurements already, the right of an employer to do this. But no, your point's well taken. The rules of procurement in the tender documents have to line up with the IPD model.
Right.
And the principles, the collaborative principles of the model and so on. And there are some gaps there.
But what you say, I think, about permission is really is meaningful. I haven't really thought about it that way. And if I think about it and I turn it around in my head, we're giving people the permission to build a new system, which means that we have to supply actors to the system. We have to find people who are able to do it in the way that we believe the system will operate best. And it's different for everybody. So there's no, the standardization that you find in lean is really just the standardization in lean design and construction of the starting points. Where do you begin? How do you get organized? Yeah. But once we've been organized, we see we have to build a supply system for procurement that allows us to do the kind of procurement that gives us the rich teams we need. Yeah. We need to educate the contractors on their new role, which is to provide value through mentorship and coordination and managing safety on the site, but is different than their old role used to be. And we have to educate trades on what collaborative flow actually looks like on a job and how that benefits them. And we have to educate designers and consultants that all of these steps, the schematic drawings and the design development and the issued for construction, are really the valuable plan is issued for construction. Now, sketching things on the back of an envelope could be considered schematic, or flying through a model and looking at different options could be thought of as schematic, but it's not a holistic process. As Stan Chu said, we need to chunk more and batch less. Yeah. We just have to get out there and do it.
The other thing besides this permission is that what are we giving people permission to do? Something they desperately already want to do. People want to collaborate. I'm convinced of this.
Well, when I do I kick off a project with love and loathe, and I don't know if you've been on one of those love and loathe things yet, but no. You start off with a group of contractors, a group of owners, an IPD team, could be school kids, and you talk about design and construction. And so the first 10, 15 minutes, people break into groups of 3 and they write down on stickies, one idea per sticky. This is the fundamental buyer belief in stickies. Right. What do they love about construction and design? And they'll say things like collaboration and teamwork, and we build great buildings, and we help communities, and we do all kinds of really wonderful aspirational things. And then after we've done that, I say, okay, now I'm going to give you an hour to write down what you loathe about construction and design. And that usually gets a chuckle because they only get 10 minutes. But the things that people loathe are usually processes. They're usually things we can change. They're RFIs, they're unrealistic expectations, they're bad budgets, they're submittal processes, they're bidding, they're losing a bid. Although there is every once in a while there's somebody who says, I love bidding and I love winning bids. And it's just a junky adrenaline. And I know it's not good for the system, but I love it. So you go, okay, well, let's try to figure out something that, that gets to that love and loathe. But it's funny because at the end of love and loathe, I say, okay, if we do more of what we love and less of what we loathe, that's lean construction right there. It's a pretty easy way to explain it.
It gets right at the heart of it.
And people have self-created what their charter is, or their their constitution or their basic cultural pillars for the project that they're going to go on. They're going to do more of what they love and less of what they loathe.
One of the things that's kept me going here along the way of this journey. You guys love to use the word journey. It is a journey.
That's a band that used to have Phil. What's his name?
Is it? Okay. Well, anyway, one of the things that's kept me going is many occasions along the way I've talked to people who have done IPD. Without exception, so far, everyone I've talked to has said, almost literally, to a person, I would never go back. So I asked them why. And by the way, this ranges from senior executives to the foreman. And I asked them why. And I get the most common response I get is, I'm tired of waking up every morning to go have a fight. This is much more fun.
Right.
I feel like I'm actually doing something constructive. But the foreman was really interesting. He was, he's been a foreman all his life. The guy was, early 50s, for God's sake. I bumped into him in the hallway near this big room once and asked him that question. And he had a very interesting response. His eyes kind of got watery because I guess no one had quite asked him this, what became, what to him was actually a very significant question. Why do you like this? And he just said, the first thing that came to his mind, he said, because they listened to me. No one's ever listened to me before, in that way that a good funcking IPD team has.
Listening to understand, yeah.
Listen, well, just hearing him out, he just you ask the foreman's the guy who's actually doing the work,
right?
And what a novel concept. Talk to the guy who's actually doing the work, who after a certain time certainly has ideas about how the work could be done better if only he could communicate that to the everybody else in the team, but he can't because nobody listens to him. And finally, this fellow has somebody who's actually asking him, how can I improve your job? And he's got answers. It's very gratifying.
I think the big room, the kind of lean operating system, provides a forum for having those conversations.
Yeah.
And it's pretty early on that people understand that there's no real hierarchy in that room.
That's right.
That if they have a good idea, they're expected. Not only they're invited to share it, but they're expected to share it. This is exactly the guy we want to have on our job. We want to have a person that says, that just doesn't make sense to me. Let's go pursue that. Yeah. And in the, somewhere behind the iron curtain of construction delivery, that never surfaces. And that surfaces in the big room on a regular basis, which I think is really great.
Yeah. It's the whole point of it.
So
it's the whole point of it.
So what's next for you in terms of getting, you already talked about CCDC, maybe making some tweaks here and there. What about getting owners? And where do you see your evangelism? Because I know you're an evangelist because I hear you scream Eureka every once in a while.
Look, what's next? Education, and getting people to talk to each other. But I think that's tremendously important. There's a hunger out there for this. Okay, so we created the CCDC 30 contract and it's out there, but it certainly hasn't stopped the questions, because of course the CCDC 30, like any other contract, doesn't actually tell you how to do it. Right. It sets the ground rules, but it doesn't tell you how to do an IPD job. It doesn't tell you how to do lean. It mentions lean concepts, but it doesn't tell you how to do it. So and there is I think a growing hunger for learning about this stuff in ways that are perhaps a little better, a little more comprehensive, perhaps a little more accessible than what might be out there now. And so that's a big focus of mine.
One of the things that you suggested is that I'll use Edward Wilson's term, there be a consilience, that we begin to talk to all the people who have done this. We have to have a forum someplace that's a neutral place where we can all get together, that's not influenced for any segment of the industry, but that is a big room for the exchange of
Yes.
ideas, an agora
Yes.
almost,
Yes.
where we can talk about our experiences, free of trying to con a client into doing something, or free of trying to do something else, where we can just
Oh,
share what we've learned. And I think that's probably important before the CCDC 30 tweaks are made. Maybe that's something you and I should be
yes.
working on here in the next
Yes.
little while, that we get
Yes.
all of the people in the different organizations and their different approaches, and we get them together to talk about ways of seeing and knowing, as our Indigenous friends tell
Yeah.
us. We need to have our own ways of seeing and our own ways of knowing that allow us to really deliver fundamentally what is a great promise of IPD.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
as the purist in the room, I'm always as happy as I am to see the number of IPDs that are going on. I'm always a little disappointed that we didn't make as much progress as we could have, which is part of my own quote journey. I mean, I'm with you on journey. I just can't think of a better way of talking about it. I think of it as learning, my learnings, but it is a path, and it is it is a road less taken. It's something. So I guess journey is as good as I'm trying to give up on, all of these barriers that I put up. Like, I hated using the term journey. I really didn't like using any of the Toyota Japanese words for things, because they're always kind of misinterpreted in a very Western,
Right.
cut and dried way, when they really, I mean, Kaizen is a whole experience of sensei. Lawyers in Japan are called senseis, which means teacher or mentor. And
How interesting.
we'd hardly be called senseis here.
Yeah. How interesting. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it suffers from translation, right?
Yeah.
And it also allows people to get, culturally aligned against it. Oh, that's just a Japanese thing, it'll never work here.
Yeah.
And it's much broader than that. It is a very, it's a deep philosophy of really seeing that we don't need to do all these things that we do. We only have time to do certain things, and to have our days, and I had a kid in one of my lean construction management classes at the University of Denver, who spent his day following trades around to make claims against them. And he reminded
Talk
me
about a
of,
schizophrenic existence. All right.
he's like the guy who runs the complaint department at the department store, right?
Right.
There's a
Right.
great children's book called Ludlow Laughs, about the guy who's at the department store, and he's when he sleeps, he laughs deeply. And there's a whole syndrome. I had a friend who had this syndrome of laughing at night. It's a psychological syndrome, so I don't want to make fun of it. But his laugh is so infectious and contagious that a radio station breaks in through his window every night and broadcasts it to the entire world, and it makes everybody feel better. And yet he's the guy that runs the complaint department. And the end of the story is that one night he doesn't laugh, and everybody's packing up their equipment. They have to go away, and people all over the world are sad. But in the morning, Ludlow wakes up with a smile on his face. And it's such an endearing story that it reminds me of, that's what, when you and I really have great successes out there, we wake up in the morning with a smile on our face, that some of this stuff is getting better. We're having a small influence on how we build better buildings in the world. And that's a pretty significant thing. It's kind of cool.
It is cool. And I'm very lucky. I'm just very lucky. I'm lucky to have landed on CCDC. I'm at a time when they wanted to do this. I'm lucky to have met you and the people that you've introduced me to. I'm just a lucky guy.
I consider myself really fortunate too. And I just wonder, my kids have said to me, Dad, you're the luckiest guy in the world. And I go, I know. It's because I do two things. I get out of bed in the morning and I go stand in the street of luck. And if you do those two things, it's likely that you'll be hit by the bus of luck. You never know where it's going to knock you, but it does move you in good directions. Like, it is the residue of design. You do have to get out of bed in the morning and go chase it, and then that luck comes to you.
Listen, there's much to be said for being a personification of IPD and lean. And if being a generally happy person is a personification of this, that's Exhibit A.
Count me in. Right. Your witness.
You're a witness.
I'm finished, Your Honor. Thank you so much. Well, this has been great, Geza. Thank you so much, my friend, for your time, mostly for your energy in both getting your folks to allow me to stay in this wonderful and beautiful country, but your energy around the things that, this common goal that we have, that there's a better way to build buildings. And that industry is so important. I mean, it is shelter for people. It's where things happen. It's where learning happens. It's where babies are born. It's where final goodbyes are said. It's an important aspect of everything that we engage in. And if we could just do it better, how cool is that?
There's nothing better. But Dick, thanks very much. This has been a great conversation, as they always are.
Thank you for tuning in to the Lean Construction Blogs podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please help us spread the word by sharing, subscribing, or leaving a review on your preferred podcast listening platform. Remember to join us next time as we continue to lower the barriers to applying lean construction and help take your lean journey to the next level. And don't forget to visit the Lean Construction blog to stay up to date on our latest podcast episodes, weekly blog posts, monthly webinars, and upcoming conferences. We hope to see you on the next episode.